Well, hello, and you're very welcome to another webinar by XTM International. Today, we're going to talk about terminology management and integration with Termweb. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Iñaki Hernandez Laza, and I'm a member of the experts team at XTM. Before we start, though, I would like to mention a few housekeeping rules. This webinar is being recorded, and you will receive the recording afterwards, and you will also be able to access it in the future through XTM On Demand. If you haven't done so yet, please visit our website and register to access many XTM's webinars. This will give you free access to past webinars on many different subject matters. All participants are muted by default, and if you wish to ask a question, please do so via the chat panel. I will try and answer questions at the end of the session if time permits. So let's start today with the topic, terminology management and integration with Termweb. Today we're going to cover some principles of terminology management. As part of the XTM TermManager module, we're going to carry out a monolingual term extraction, an alignment and a bilingual term extraction. We're going to look into the functionality for import and export term bases as well. And then I'll cover some aspects of Termweb and synchronization with XTM. And as part of the Termweb module as well, or the application, the program, I will also show you some workflow creation and notifications. How many times have you heard in terminology management the following things? Clients saying to you, we have no terminology at all, or we only have an Excel with source and target columns, or in many cases where clients have multiple language service providers. LSP1 called this field context sentence, but LSP2 called it example. Are they talking about the same thing? Again, how do you translate certain terminology into Spanish? Is it Latin American Spanish? Is it European Spanish? Or French Canadian? Or French France? Again, regional variants are a very important part of terminology. Or again, how many times do you have a project manager coming to you and say, can we have a last-minute translation, please, for the word set? Well, you don't have the context, you don't have a product specification. Is it talking about an engineering set? Is it talking about a medical set? Or is it talking about a set that Rafa Nadal won in the French Open? You don't really know. So again, many clients have terminology legacy in Excel, in TBX, in SDLTBs, or in CSV. So where do we start in terminology? It's important to define some principles in terminology management. Mainly today, I'm going to cover four very, very quickly before we go into a demo. First of all, canonical form capitalizations and inflections. Terminology should consider these aspects very, very carefully. And again, terms should be listed in term bases only in their basic canonical form, in singular form, and inflected. In other words, you will have a verb like apply. You will not have things like applied, or will apply, or would have applied. You have it in the infinitive form. Again, terms should not be capitalized unless the capitalization of nouns is required by specific languages, like perhaps German. Another principle of best practice in terminology is that of term autonomy, which basically means that terms should describe a concept with specific metadata categories. In other words, every denomination for a term, for a concept, should have its own individual column, cell, and field. Many times we see things whereby a term is followed by something similar, separated by a comma, by a forward slash, or in brackets. Let's say the example of local area network bracket LAN. That is incorrect. You should have two different cells for the two denominations. Data elementarity is a principle of data modeling, which dictates, again, that a single metadata field must contain only one item of information. So things such as context, definitions, usage notes should not be added directly to the term. In other words, you don't say apply bracket verb. Again, every categorization has to be pertained in their own specific field. And granularity, again, is a data modeling parameter whereby it describes that every categorization should have their own thing. Let's say part of speech, and then saying noun, comma, singular wouldn't be correct. You will have gender, parts of speech, noun, gender, masculine, feminine, number, singular, plural, etc. So basically, we see that terminology is much more than just creating a glossary. It's really a methodology that begins at the term mining extraction in order to translate effectively, review it, validate it, deploy it online, and reutilize it across the enterprise. So it is a collection of processes to maximize corporate communication and intellectual asset reuse. And of course, it's a demonstrated way of reducing globalization costs as well. Today, as I say, we're going to do a small monolingual extraction, a small bilingual extraction. We have a look at the output. Obviously, that output has to be translated, approved, and then we look at Termweb as well. Before we go into the demo, when it comes to Termweb synchronization with XTM, obviously that has to be done through the API templates in Termweb. And obviously, what you have to do is make sure that the customer that you have pertaining with that synchronization has to have specific parameters. In other words, the terminology is not coming from XTM, it's coming from Termweb. The Termweb details are customer specific, and you have the login name for the client, the API key that Termweb is providing you with, and the URL. And again, you have a number of templates there that you have to synchronize. And again, when it comes to the project editor in XTM, you have to make sure that the Termweb template has to be the appropriate one as well. So before we go into further things, let me go into showing you a couple of files that we're going to use for today's demo. I have a file in English, which contains some text about XTM, workflow, engine, workbench, QA manager, etc. And I also have a corresponding Spanish file, which we're going to use for the alignment. But first of all, let's do a monolingual extraction in XTM. Typically, when you do not have a bilingual file and you just want to identify typically nouns, noun phrases, verbs pertaining to a file. As you know, XTM can read natively a myriad of file formats, so you can put the usual Office Suite, Doc, Excel, PowerPoint, but anything like JSON files, PDFs, XMLs, HTMLs, any kind of file pretty much would be natively identified by XTM. Let's say we're going to have a monolingual term extraction, and I'm going to call it monolingual term extraction. I'm not going to bother with delivery due dates because it's not really relevant at this point in time. I'm going to say is from English US, and specific to target language. Really, it's not really important because it's monolingual. But anyway, I just want to select Spanish because then the output will have something there. Now I'm going to select my file, which is the English file. And by the way, XTM has the capability of performing term mining, term extraction from languages other than English. So if you have a source file in French or in German or Spanish, of course you can run a monolingual term extraction in those languages as well. So I'm going to execute this, and in here you will see an option called Run Terminology Extraction. So I'm going to select, and I'm going to create this project. Now this project now is going to go through XTM, through the phase of analysis, word counts, etc., etc. But obviously, this is taking a bit of time. It's been analyzed. But once this is analyzed, we'll be able to, there you go, it's analyzed now. So I'm going to go to the hamburger menu, and I'm going to say download and generate the extracted terms. This is going to generate now, identifying key terms, key nouns, noun phrases, and verbs typically. And let me see if this has been generated already, extracted terms. So my extracted terms are going to go into my download directory. And here we have it. We have a file here, and it has identified potential terms in English like XTM Workbench, user, memory, engine, etc. The second column is called surface forms, and these are derivatives of the original term in English. In other words, if you see here the example of translator, you can see how it has been parsed in capital T. We should put in lower T, obviously, but it also tells you that translators, lowercase plural, has appeared 5 times in that file, translator in singular, uppercase once, and translator in lowercase singular ones as well. So they are derivatives of the main term identify. It's telling me the frequency, the total frequency. It's telling me where it was found, in what file, and it also provided me with additional context information for translators, so they know how to translate the term correctly. Okay, so this will be a monolingual term extraction. Obviously, like any other tool, this has to be validated and clean. This is a raw output, and obviously we're not going to need things like XTM. If we have XTM Workbench, you wouldn't need Workbench. And again, any information that is too generic, terminology that is, let's say, typically Microsoft generic terminology like file, open, apply, things like that might be generated in a terminology extraction, but it's not really a very difficult terminology to translate. The main purpose of terminology is to identify and centralize terminology which is specific and relative to the customer subject matter. So that would be how the terminology extraction works at monolingual level. And of course, once you clean the information in the context, etc., the translators can provide their translations here. And that file then can be uploaded as a term base into XTM. But today I also want to show you how to do a bilingual extraction. And a bilingual extraction based on the files that we have here. As I said to you, we have I have a file in English and the corresponding file in Spanish. XTM gives us the capability of aligning source and target files. And this is very, very relevant when we have customers who do not have translation memories, but they do have source files and the corresponding targets in any language that they may work on. So this can be achieved through the TM module, translation memory module, and there's a functionality to manage the translation memories. There's a module to import translation memories, to export translation memories, but also to align. And this part of alignment is going to give us as well a bilingual extraction. So let's do a test, and let's call this bilingual term extraction. And we're going to select here as a source language, English US. And of course, we have all the variants that we can work on. As a target language, I'm going to work on Spanish, Spain. And I have my source file, which is my English file, and my target file, which is my Spanish file. Now, an important consideration here. You can have 1,000 files of different file formats. In other words, I can have JSON files, HTMLs, XMLs, docs, PPTs, PDFs. What you have to do is put them as a zip file, and the source file is your zip containing those 1,000 files in the source, and your target file is a zip containing the equivalent 1,000 files in the target language. Language to language, one pair at a time. It's important as well that the target files have a similar naming convention so the tool knows where to look and map them accordingly. But there is an option here that says extract bilingual terminology. And we're going to select that. And we're going to click on align. Oh, customer, sorry. I select the customer and we align it. So this is going to be aligning now the English file versus the Spanish file. And it's at the same time going to perform a term extraction whereby it's going to identify key terms in English and potential corresponding files in the target language. And as you can see, has been done. I download this, and this is going to give me 3 files. Let me go to my downloads directory. This is going to give me 3 files, as we see now. It's going to give me an align file, an align 90+, whereby the tool is thinking that 90% plus probability the segments have been aligned correctly, as you will see here now. So basically source to target segments, and this can constitute then a TM. Remember I was mentioning before, situations where a customer doesn't have a TM, but they have source and target files. By doing this alignment, these now can be taken as a TM and can be imported as a TM, and therefore can be exported again as a TMX file or as an Excel, as you wish. But as part of this exercise, it's also doing an alignment of the terms. And it's telling me here the following. I have the US, the surface forms, the frequency, the founding file, the context, but it's also giving me the corresponding Spanish, the Spanish one, the surface forms, and the context pertaining to the context in the original source file. So if we make it smaller for you to have a look, you will see how we have an equivalence here. And if we have things like engine, task, tarea, customer, clientes, requirement, requisitos, text, texto, etc., etc., etc. Of course, this is a file that needs to be validated as well, needs to be validated by human terminologists or linguists to make sure that the correspondence has been done correctly and is a final file to be imported in the system. So let's, for a moment, get this file aligned terms. I'm going to import this into the system, go to terminology, and I'm going to select XTM terminology module. Let's assume we've done a bilingual extraction. Let's assume we have done a raw output validation. Let's assume we have done a target output validation, again, to make sure everything is working. And we have a final file that is in good quality. So I can import this file. But before we do so, let me show you something, because the terminology module also allows us to tag information and terminology. Under the configuration data tags, I have created a tag group called Terminology February 2023. I'm going to use this tag group and these tags to import the terminology and mark it like this. So then I know exactly what is coming from and the origin of this terminology. So I go to terminology, and again, I'm going to select all customers. And let me explain this in a bit more detail. Right, we go to the import part, and I'm going to import it under this customer, terminology webinar, TermManager. I'm going to choose my file, and I know it's located under downloads, bilingual term extraction, aligned terms. Now, I'm not going to add to any existing concepts because this is my first import, so I don't have anything to add to. This is particularly relevant when you have an original upload and then you have new terminology that you want to upload, and you can say, add it to existing concepts in English, for instance. In other words, I have an English glossary, a source file, source language rather, a source language, and I want to add additional terminology to that, and I can obviously select it here, right? But in this particular case, given that it's my first import, I don't need to select add to existing customers. I want to mark that this terminology is valid. Why? Because I have done the bilingual extraction, I have done the raw output validation, and I have gone through preliminary checks by human terminologists or linguists to make sure that the terms are correctly identified and correctly translated in the target. So I'm going to put it as valid. And I'm going to set the tags as, again, I have a number of tag groups in the system. In this one, terminology February 23. Of course, I can have multiple variables within a tag group. In other words, I can have multiple things. Let's say we have a client that produces peripherals, and I could have tags that say laptop, desktops, servers, screens, mice, etc., etc. So you can have multiple values of tags within a tag group. Okay, so I can apply that, and I'm going to import the file. So this file is going to go through the import. It's in progress, and it's already successfully imported. So if I go to my manage again, you will see how this terminology is being already imported here. And as you can see here, the tag specifying here is coming from terminology February 2023. If I had multiple imports with multiple tags, of course, I can select in the searches, and I can determine here, search for terminology only applicable to a specific tag group. In this case, obviously, we only have one tag group, so that is the case. But anyway, that is how the functionality would work. And of course, you have the metadata taxonomy. You have the context in here, the status that is valid, etc., etc. Modified by Iñaki on the 23rd of February at this particular time, created by, etc., etc. And I have also my targets in here. Now, let's assume you have now a terminology term base here, database with a lot of content, with tags, with taxonomies specifying remarks, product fields, whatever the case you want to really, you can then export it. And when it comes to exporting, you have a number of ways of doing it. You can export this. I'm going to reset this. I want that tag in there. I want to export here, and I have multiple functionality. I can export into XLS, XLS, TBX, or MTF, which, as you know, is part of a file for Travel Studio compatibility. So again, when it comes to concept and term, we support concept orientation fields and term orientation fields. If we want a concept orientation field, it has to be typically at the right-hand side of the spreadsheet. What is the typical example of a concept orientation field? Something like a definition, technical definition, or a description. It applies to the concept and to the subsequent terms and the languages in which it occurs, right? But again, I can export all the fields at concept level and at term level, or I can even suggest and say, you know what, I only want to export the definition, or I only want to export at term level the parts of speech. So you can define as well what fields of metadata taxonomy you can export based on concept or term orientation. Or you can also do a search and export only the terms from that particular search. So if you, for instance, have a search and says, find for me all the terms, all the nouns, noun phrases that contain the word computer. There might be 25 terms that contain computer. And then you can select those from the search and export only those terms. Let me quickly do an export into Excel. And I'm going to export a couple of things more as well. Let me export into TBX. And also I want to export into the last format I want to show you, which is the MTF. So basically, these files are now being downloaded. Let me go to my downloads directory. And first of all, let's have a look at the Excel extraction. And you will see how these terms have the information here, enable editing. And you will have, of course, many fields for languages that we have selected in the system, right? But obviously we could have selected only English and Spanish, right? But you will have everything in the system at the moment. Now, if we go to my TBX file, let me extract this into TBX, and we would have the terminology that we created. Let me do XTM tools preprint, and you will have it like that. So you have the terms exported from XTM TermManager, you have the definition of the term, the source language code, and again, you have the information. Term customer, the context, the customer was very pleased with the product purchase, etc., etc. Modification, Iñaki, Spanish, cliente, context information, etc., etc. Let me finally show you the final format that we did, which is the MTF. And you will see how the MTF file will contain, if I open this in Notepad++, you will see how this file will contain the terminology, but also the segments associated with in there. So let's see if this opens. Let's give it a second, and here you have it. So you have the information here. Let me do a bit of a tidy up here, and then you have it. You have the term customer, cliente, etc. But then you have the sentences as well, but it appears in this particular format for Travel Studio. Okay. Now let's jump into the second part of the webinar today, which is more about Termweb. So as I was saying before, it's important that you, let me go back to the PowerPoint. I want to show you this again. It's important that the customer in XTM that you want to map or integrate or synchronize with Termweb has to be selected. So on the customer list, TermManager, that is your client, obviously, in this particular case, and you have to map it. Obviously, you'll have your login name for Termweb, your API key, and your URL. And again, at project level, you have to select the template appropriately as well. So let's go into, let's forget about this for a moment, and let's go into Termweb 4. And in here, I'm going to show you a glossary called photography demo and a section as well. Now you can categorize information and term bases by dictionaries and sections. Following the example that I gave you a few minutes ago, you can have a client that says client Acme. I'm not going to mention any client in particular, but then you have sections laptops, desktops, servers, screens, mice. You can have multiple sections within a dictionary. Okay, let me show you something that I have prepared in terms of some terminology on photography. Term aperture. Again, we have the concept information on the top, which is a dictionary photography demo pertaining to a section, also called that. The domain is photography. The subject matter is digital cameras. And I have a definition of aperture. A definition is typically a concept-oriented field, a space through which light passes in an optical or photographic instrument, etc., etc. And of course, I can put an image as well, which incidentally, we can, of course, put on in the XTM terminology module as well. Again, notice how we have then the concept IDs in here, concept ID 1, and then we have the English with concept ID 1, and then the Spanish with 1, 2. And again, I have my translation in Spanish. Notice how we have the regional variant with the Spanish flag. I could have the Argentinian flag or the Mexican flag or the Peruvian flag in order to represent the different language variants of that particular language. And again, I have the sample sentence in Spanish as well. And these two are quite important. Let me explain the difference between a process status and a user status. The user status is whether the term is preferred, is rejected, is pending for approval, or is deprecated, for instance. Whereas the process status is more an administrative field of metadata that tells us that that terminology has gone through the process of being approved by an in-country reviewer. So we're saying, yes, it has been gone through that process. It has been verified by an in-country reviewer. And then the status at the usage level, it is preferred or rejected or deprecated or obsolete, etc., etc., etc. Now, one of the beauties of Termweb as well is that we can have relationships between terms. In other words, the term lens here, we have a definition of a lens, we have the translation, but also we can have a relation and I can show a graph. So basically, I'm saying that the term lens aperture is subordinate to the term lens. So I can start establishing relationships between terminology and say, are they at the same level or are they subordinate to the main concept? So that is an important feature of Termweb. Now, let me go back to cloud, because what I want to show you now is a project that I have in here that I have created for you in the past. And I want to show you how the terminology is coming from Termweb. So let me go back to this particular project in Italian and Spanish. I'm going to open the one in Spanish. And you can see now how the terminology is what we call has been decorated. And by that, we mean that the terminology, if it's in the term base, it's going to be in blue, basically telling translators, here's your term, shortest speed. And look at that, shortest speed appears in red and appears in black. Now, let's go to the term shortest speed in Termweb. And it's telling me that this is rejected, velocidad obturación. The preferred term should be velocidad de obturación. So if I go back to my project here in the workbench, you will see how velocidad de obturación is correct. And I have all my metadata taxonomy there. And my term velocidad obturación is rejected. Of course, in XTM, we have the terminology panel where the term is referenced and is proposed to the translator. And all they have to do is right click and insert it into the segment. Okay, so that ensures consistency and quality in the translations. So basically, this is term decoration and how it works, right? Now, let me show you a couple of things in relation to Termweb as well. One of the things that I want to show you is how you can create workflows. And workflows are quite important in the sense that it's going to give you email notifications about certain aspects or certain modifications that have happened in the term base. So one of the things I want to show you today is going to workflows, excuse me. And again, I have created here any changes to the status of terminology in the photography demo. I'm going to select here, and it's going to send me an email. So I basically said, if anything is changed at status level in my photography demo term base, please send me an email, and send me an email as a HTML report. So let's do that in practice and see how this works. So let's go into my term base again. Let's go to in here, and let's say, for instance, the term shutter speed. And I'm going to say that this, instead of rejected, I'm going to change it and put it to a different user status. I can edit my term here, and I'm going to say I'm going to put it as not recommended. Okay, and I'm going to save the term. Now, in a few seconds, we'll probably hear a ping coming into my email, and we know that we have an email created by Termweb telling me that according to the workflow rule that I have established, and that should be it. And here you have it. XTM Experts, which is my login account to this Termweb instance, has updated entry ID 11, concept ID 11, shutter speed has been modified to not recommended. So I can then obviously go back to my concept 11 in my Termweb, and this is concept 11 ID, as you can see here. So it is a fantastic feature to have, because when you have a project like I worked in the past in 52 languages with serious complexities in terminology, it's very, very easy to set up a workflow notification whereby anything that has changed in the term, you will be notified. Of course, within the system here, you can create user management, you can create groups. Let's say you create a group of Spanish terminologists, and then you may have 2 or 3 people there. You can create different access rights and who is able to do certain things. But again, in the system and the user management, a couple of things that has to be done. In order for Termweb to synchronize with XTM, you have to create an API template. And this is the API template that I created. In other words, basically you're transferring the information from Termweb into XTM. And of course, when it comes to the system and the user management, that client information, this is our login name. Of course, that is a key that I won't show for obvious reasons, but that is your API key. And remember, that API key is the one that has to be populated in here in XTM in order to synchronize it. Okay. Now, when it comes to creating term bases in Termweb, it's very, very simple, and it's very flexible, and you can create as many things as you want. Let's say you can create a dictionary wizard whereby you can do a test here. You can put a description, of course, and from here you can create pretty much in all languages, let's say, or maybe you can say English and Spanish. Let's say that for the sake of simplicity. And again, you can define concept level fields that are given to you by default by Termweb. You can say definition is going to be there, and maybe you can say a term level fields, an example, grammatical number, part of speech, etc., etc. So you can create a term base like this. You can also create a term base in other ways. An import dictionary definition. If you have an XDT file, you can import an XDT file, and that XDT file will contain the complexity of many terms, many fields of metadata, which ones apply to concept level, which ones apply to term level. Again, you can do a quick import, and if you select a file here in Excel or a TBX, Termweb is going to identify those and create basically a structure of a dictionary accordingly. And you can also create it from scratch. If you want to, you can create a new dictionary, and you can say, this is my test dictionary. And again, you select your add languages. And what I want to show you here is a couple of things that are quite interesting in terms of flexibility. I can create that, but I can also apply a regional variant here. And I'm going to say my region is, United States. I can save that. And let's create the one for Spanish as well. I want to add a language here, and I'm going to say Spanish, and I'm going to create it into European Spanish with my Spain. Here it is. You can apply that, but then you can also apply concept level fields and term level fields. For instance, if I go to the predefined fields that we have here, definition. Okay, I can put it there. But let's assume that I have a concept-oriented field that is customizable to me, is very personal about my company, something very, very specific. I can add it here as well. And I can say it's a new custom field. And I'm going to call it demo field, which appears at concept level. But I'm also going to say that it's a pick list, let's say. Okay, and within that pick list, I can add values. I can say that is a value of 1, value 2, value 3, etc. Again, remember the example that I gave you before. You may have a customer and you say, subject matter, for instance, right? And you have number 1 is laptops, number 2 is desktops, number 3 is servers, number 4 is mice, number 5 is screens, something like that, right? So you can apply accordingly. And again, you can modify and select the positioning of those fields in the system. And again, when it comes to term level field, you can apply specific ones that are provided to you by the system. Again, you can say an example, or again, you can create customizable fields like in here. And again, you can select whether it is a text field, a multi-valued, a pick list, etc. Now, coming back to XTM, we have similar configuration in here, whereby you can create in data, you can create custom fields for terminology as well. So again, I can have an application. Within an application, I have multiple values. I can have definition sources, etc., differentiators, DNTs, examples. You could add any information here and say, this is called my demo field. I'm just making it up, obviously. And I'm going to say that it's a drop-down, it's a hyperlink, it's a number, it's a text field, for instance. Let's say multiple selection. And again, I can call it, again, any specific name for TBX mapping as well. And I'm going to say it applies to concept level or to term level. Okay, let's say it applies to concept level. And I can say my value is 1, my value is 2, my value is 3, my value is 4. Excuse me, the mouse is acting up. Anyway, I save this. And again, I have that categorization of the customizable fields in XTM as well. Okay. So hopefully this gave you an overall idea. Of course, terminology is much more complex than this. Terminology, we can spend hours and hours on end talking about terminology. But at this point in time, I just want to ask, are there any particular questions that you want to ask at this point before we wrap up the session? Remember that, of course, any questions that you may have, you can send me an email at ihernandez@xtm.cloud, or you can also send us an email to the experts team at experts@xtm.cloud.